this is okay. Now we are going to, of course, we more or less have given a particular preparation in trying to understand why eventually the church gradually opened to the world, especially during the Second Vatican Council, especially in the last document of the council, which was Gaudium et Spes. Okay, let's just move on with these slides. Okay, our objective is to provide a critique of the old moral theology, to understand the immediate background and context of such development, to focus on the recent developments in moral theology, especially after Vatican II, and appreciate the shifts in perspectives, focus, etc. Okay, let's move on. Okay, just to summarize what we have done with the previous session, isn't it that we tried to study patristic or practical wisdom theology, okay? uh, among the fathers of the church. And then we moved on to monastic penitentiary guidelines. And then this gave way to scholastic rational synthesis. And then eventually, especially with the Tridentine reaction to Protestant reforms, there came about casuistry, and manuals. And then we said that in the last 2 centuries, this gave way to modern approach to moral theology, particularly of a more personalist approach, coming from Louis Jansen's in particular, and eventually finding expression during the Second Vatican Council. What we see here is is a kind of a development that gradually moved away from human experience. Okay, isn't it, when you talk about practical wisdom, you always have to deal with human experience, isn't it? Okay, and then gradually, especially with rational synthesis, it was gradually moving away, very detached from human experiences in such a way that the scholastic preoccupation were so rational, okay, that they became so impractical. Okay, like there were discussions about how many angels can stand at the tip of the needle, etc. Those are useless discussions that were too far fetched from human experience. Okay, and also it was a moving away from the sacred scriptures. You see that the patristics was very much grounded in the scriptures until it got uh, in a way, especially with the high scholasticism. Thomas Aquinas, of course, was very much into the sacred scriptures too. Especially there was a synthesis in biblical, dogmatic, etc. But what happened, especially as a result of this, moving extremely away from this, happened during the time of the casuistry and the manuals. And then we see that in the last 2 centuries, there were actually attempts not to be able to get back to the scriptures and get back to human experience. And that somehow paved the way for the Second Vatican Council. Critique of the older approach. The older approach, had to give way to a new methodology in Vatican II precisely because, again, just like what happened with Judaism, just like what happened during the time of the penitentiary books, just what happened during the time of casuistry, there was so much preoccupation with sin, there was excessive casuistry, there was a multiplication of the law. Okay, it became law oriented. There was a confusion between the moral law and the positive law of the church, as if what the church legislates or promulgates is almost immediately equivalent to moral law, which should not be understood as the case. Of course, we can presume that the church believes that what she teaches is based on the moral law, but that has to be still, in a way, worked out and nuanced. There was an overemphasis on abstract principles. Too much reasoning, divorced from revelation, okay, from the biblical tradition, very rationalistic approach, and it was lacking in social obligations, no? It was neglecting the social dimension of moral reasoning. So that was how the moral uh, approach, older approach in moral theology was, and for which reason it was heavily criticized, that it cannot be sustained anymore, especially when we talk about renewal in the church. Okay, when we speak of Vatican II renewal of moral theology, there were certain things that happened. Okay, shift in focus, shift in worldview, and shift in method. Remember these three. These are very important. Shift in method, shift in worldview, and shift in focus. Let's start with the first one. Shift in focus. Okay? In understanding moral theology, there was a movement from a discipline for confessors, okay, like very confessional, no? Uh, and it was actually just, confessors are guided by penitentiary books, by manuals, etc. And it simply surrenders to that. It does not, engage this text in a very critical way. But now we speak of moral theology that has been open to critical understanding of faith for moral living. So take note of the critical understanding. So there is the dimension of critical distanciation, okay? Okay, from our own tradition. Because tradition could be confessional, okay? So there was from a purely rational to one that is more open to revelation and faith. Dati kasi, sabihin mo, no, yung surrender, ito yung turo ng simbahan. This is what the church teaches. And later on, then the teaching of the church became highly, purely rational. So it was devoid of the freshness of revelation and of faith. So there was a movement from there. So then from isolated, individualistic, act-oriented, sin-oriented approach to morality and moral life to one that is focused on the total vocation of living in relationship and in response to God's self-communication to us in creation, in history, and most fully in Jesus. Do you understand the shift more or less? Okay? If we were to demonstrate that in a diagram, okay, before you talk about fixed tradition, you surrender to that in a very confessional way. Okay? It was also purely rational tradition. Okay, that was focused on act, law oriented, and therefore requires only the minimum. Okay? So the shift of focus gave way to critical thinking. Okay? It is important that theology engages our rationality and critical capacity. Okay? Like for example, if I'm going to ask you an article that you need to reflect, for example, on particular topic, you could actually do that in a very confessional way. I feel God, etc. Touch me and all that. That's confessional. Okay? Uh, but when you do critical rationality or critical thinking, you in a way locate this discourse within the whole development in critical reasoning. Okay? So you try to engage it and look at tradition in a more objective, distantiated way. So here you move on from to open to revelation. Okay? It's a kind of a moral theology that in a way allows itself to be inspired by the resources of our faith, okay, especially coming from the biblical tradition. So, and then finally, the third is a movement from act to person, from law to love, from minimum to maximum, which calls about perfection in Christian charity. When we speak of shift in worldview, you talk about the classicist worldview against the historical, evolving historical consciousness. What is the difference? What do you mean when you say classicist worldview? It is a kind of a worldview, the way we look at reality and the order of the world in a classical way, in a way, is very much, you know, identifying itself with well-defined essences, abstract, eternal, necessary, and fixed concepts. Parang everything is already done and fashioned, you know, already apparently available to us are the eternal laws of God that do not change. They're absolute, okay, they cannot be affected by the changing times and context because they are necessary and fixed concepts. But when you speak about historical consciousness, such consciousness generally are very specific, individual, contingent, and they constantly undergo development and changes. Okay? So when we speak of a kind of a worldview, okay, before Vatican II, we actually allowed only the classicist worldview to determine the way we look at the world. And therefore, consequently, the way we look at moral issues will always be based purely on our appreciation of the defined, abstract, necessary, and fixed eternal laws and concepts. But when you speak of a modern approach to moral theology as a result of Vatican II, we would speak about the importance of the evolving historical consciousness amongst people. Then we begin to appreciate morality always according to the specific nature of the cases, of the individual, you know, understanding of particular cases that they're condemned. We can only come up with temporary or tentative conclusions because they continue to change and develop. And we see that apparent in the evolution of our doctrines and evolution of our moral perspectives within the history of the church. So humanity as both a product and a maker of history. Okay, so that's very important to note. Okay, it is not humanity is a product, but at the same time he is also a maker of history. Okay, and therefore it is important that one begins to constantly be open to the changing times and context. In classicist worldview, the obsession and the preoccupation of people is for clarity, consistency, and precision. Okay? So if you look at the conservatives in the Vatican, especially when the Pope issued certain statements that they found very controversial, they actually would always worry about, you know, you are not making things clearer. You are not being consistent. You are not being precise with your own positions because their own preoccupation is about that. But the preoccupation in the new paradigm is to become respectful of human freedom, of the uniqueness of historical moral situation, and the unfinished character of the moral life. So take, for example, the statement of Pope Francis on LGBT, okay? Plus, X, etc. Marami pa yan. Pero ang sabi niya, okay, they deserve to belong to a family, and that their rights as couples or as partners should be given civil recognition and be legally protected in their rights. Okay, it does not mean that he is actually downgrading the value of marriage. He does not want to identify that with marriage, but in a way, we have to be respectful to the experience of the human freedom of the people involved. Okay, they are in very unique reality, and that we have to recognize them. Okay, and that we are not also making a definitive definition of who they are. This is an unfinished character of their moral life. Okay, all that is most important is that they are recognized in the specificity of their condition, and that they should be accorded rights accordingly. Okay, of course, you will find this in the work of Richard Gula, and when he actually makes a distinction between the classicist worldview and the modern worldview. For example, characteristics views the word as complete and fixed for all eternity. The world, yeah, not the world. The world is marked by harmony of an objective order, speaks of the world in terms of well-defined essences using abstract universal concepts. But the modern worldview views the world as dynamic and evolving through historical developments. The world is marked by progressive growth and change. It speaks of the world in terms of individual traits using concrete historical concepts. Okay? So, sorry. Kailang. Okay. So, okay, here. Uh, Moral theology and moral life. Now, from the classicist worldview, abstracts from the concrete to deal with issues of the abstract, deals with the universal of humanhood by deriving principles from the nature of man. Kaya nga, even the whole question of contraception and all that is always about what is natural and defined as so. Conforms to authority, pre-established norms, emphasis on duty and obligation, lacks integration with faith and revelation. But modern worldview deals with issues in the concrete particularity of historical moment, okay? Deals with a historical person in particular circumstances. It talks about formulation of norms are historically conditioned, okay? Emphasis on responsibility and actions fitting to changing times. More sound integrated with the mysteries of faith and critical use of the Bible. Do you understand? So you can see basic fundamental differences between the two. Now, when we speak of method, before Vatican II, the method that was used was deductive method. What do you mean by deductive method? Victor?
um, Deductive method, or it is from generals, the notion of from general to particular.
Okay, very good.
But yes, Father.
How about the other one? How do you call the other method?
The inductive method, it is starting from what is specific, then arriving to what is universal.
Okay, very good. Okay, so that starts with the abstract universal principles applied to concrete realities, while inductive starts with human experience. Okay, and comes up with some generalities that could be agreed upon as common to those who have experienced them. Okay, so it begins with abstract and yan yun, deductive. Okay, so yan na yun. Advantages. The class view is clear, simple, and sure in its view of reality and its conclusions about what to do. And disadvantage tends to be authoritarian in the sense of claiming to have answers suitable for all time, tends to be dogmatic in the sense of having the last word, while a modern worldview respects the uniqueness of the person and the peculiarities of historical circumstances, emphasis on the moral life as incomplete and in need of conversion, tends to be relative in the sense that everything is conditioned. tends to be antinomian in the sense that all laws are relative. Okay? Vatican II methodological consideration of moral theology, according to McCormick, actually will include the following. So there was a complete religious anthropology, meaning dignity and destiny of the human person somehow became part of the methodological consideration. So you have to start when you do moral theology after Vatican II, you have to have a very good anthropology. Okay, sensitivity to change becomes very important consideration, social, political, familial structures. Okay, ecumenical in outlook, you cannot be isolated, but you have to be able to listen to other perspectives, particularly coming from other Christian denominations. Now, theology is done using references to Protestant scholars. Like the one we did, we have been also making use of some Protestant scholarship. Okay, George Lindbeck, Hans Frey, and for example, Stanley Hauerwas also give very good insights, but of course could be complemented, okay, could complement our theological Catholic thinking. Okay, unity and understanding of moral life, which actually is found in the whole understanding of love. Then it becomes more pastorally oriented. When you say pastorally oriented, it is in a way attuned to the real situation of the people of the fold. Okay, so it what is most important are not the laws up there, okay, but actually how they become meaningful to particular realities and situation. There is also recognition of the freedom of research, according to McCormick. Okay, that scholars, in their autonomy, okay, and the autonomy of rationality, should be allowed to exercise their own freedom as researchers using their own methodologies. And then it recognizes also the competence of lay people. Okay, that more a moral theology also recognizes the input that comes from lay people. So where are we now? As a result of this, we live in an age of specialists, age of justice, age of experience, age of cultural diversity, age of technology, age of holiness and witness. Ngayon, ang pinakamahalaga ngayon sa mga tao, witness of life. Age of theological anthropology, all our theological positions have to be defined according to our theological anthropology. It starts basically on how we understand humanity. Age of ecumenism, age of women, they have a very important role to play. Post Vatican II trends in moral theory. I'm just going to go brief with this.
This is the top result.
With the new methodology, which starts from the ground, from the experience, and are keen into starting with the peculiarity of human experience, this gives way to contextual ethics and theologies, isn't it? And that became a part of the post-Vatican trends in moral theology. You have, for example, narrative ethics and theology. Okay, you have liberation ethics, feminist humanist ethics and theology. You even have queer ethics, and you have even eco-ethics and theology. Sa article ni James Kinnan, he made mention, for example, of some of this, like liberation ethics, okay, and some what other trends that James Kinnan mentioned in his article. Okay, sister, You made mention of them in your article, in your summary. Sister,
Eh, ano Father? Black theology.
yeah, Black theology. Woman is theology is a part of the Black theology. What else? African theology of inculturation. Okay, so he made mention of that. Okay, what else? In Europe, what was the trend that became prominent? The discourse of
Formation.
conscience, formation of conscience. Okay, okay. Now, these are different strands that develop after Vatican II precisely because of a new methodology that has been employed, okay, by moral theologians. Okay, if you speak of narrative ethics, the context that it wants to address is abstract, universal, and detached ethical rationality. Because before, for example, you speak about ethics being done almost in a mathematical, measured, abstract, and pallid and dry way. So to be able to address this concern, centrality of stories in the moral life and formation of people became very important. So here you talk about the importance of having to understand my my life as a story. Okay, that I have to write my life, no, as a story. It has a beginning, it has a middle, and it has a conclusion. Whether I am writing my life according to God's own purpose, or do I have a lot of narrative breaks? Pagka sinabi mong narrative breaks, yun ang sinfulness. Pagka sinabi mong my story of my life in a coherent way, you're talking about, living your life according to your commitments. For example, sister, nag-profess ka ng vow, pagkatapos ng story mo as a sister, but then you would do certain things outside of what you profess, those are narrative breaks, no? Parang nabe-break yung story because of the breaking of certain commitments. So you're not able to come up with a coherent form of life or narrative. And according to, especially from the post-liberals who actually developed the narrative ethical tradition, okay, our life as a story should be conforming to the life story of the community to which we belong. For example, ako CM ako, pagkatapos I belong to the story of my congregation that started from St. Vincent de Paul, okay, that has to have its own commitments, that one has to be able to really be for the service of the poor. And yet, ako gusto ko, puro mayayaman ang kasama ko lang. At I forget the poor. So yung narrative ko does not fit the narrative of the community to which I belong. And therefore, I may consider getting out because I do not conform with that story. So your value system, your principles somehow should articulate the story of your community. And the story of the community somehow is jiving with the story of Jesus, with the whole story of salvation, okay, that comes from God, that comes from Jesus. Okay? So yun yung coherence na to na sinasabi. So whenever we talk of moral theology, it's about living our lives like a story and in a way learning the grammar, okay, in that in the narration of my story so that I may have a more coherent form of living. Another is liberation ethics and theology. The context is dehumanizing poverty and injustice. And within that context, one asks the question, where is God? What does our faith demand of us within this particular context? And so, as a result, liberation theology was born out of a response to understanding God within the context of dehumanizing poverty and injustice. Where is God? God is on the side of the poor. God liberates the poor. So then you talk about preferential options for the poor, and that our faith demands that our faith becomes an instrument for setting us free, okay, in all its different dimensions. Okay? So if there are certain things in our faith that we understand that reinforces poverty and injustice and inequality, those will have to be liberated, from such ways of thinking. And this should give way to new ways of understanding sacrament, understanding Mama Mary, or interpreting, for example, the Trinity, or in re-understanding Jesus, etc. in our life. So that's what liberation theology. So that our faith is put at the service of our own experience of liberation. After all, that's what God wants us to experience. Okay? Third, okay, feminist or womanist ethics. The context is the humanizing patriarchy. Okay? That women are subjected to oppression, injustices because of patriarchal system that prevails in many societies. Okay? Okay, when women are looked upon as second-class citizens, are only of people of emotions, etc. So they were calling for women emancipation, and that therefore there is a need to reread even our faith and our religion and put them at the service of liberating women. Part of which is begin to understand that God is not only identified with men, because after all, God does not have sex. Okay, but then we could portray God in his anthropomorphic models by trying to portray God as a feminine, like wisdom. God is wisdom. God is compassion. God is hesed. Okay, so God is not cannot be only identified with men, but God could be identified with women as well. Okay, so but of course, let's just move on. The black women would not identify themselves with the struggle of the white feminists, because they say, no, we have always been working outside of the home, because the feminists were not allowed to work outside and all that. So, but the black women have suffered threefold marginalization because of class, they're poor, because of color, because they're black, and because they're women, etc. So feminist theology gave way to womanist theology. Alice Walker, who wrote, for example, The Color Purple, etc., became the inspiration of the womanist theologians, and it started in the early 70s with the black women theologians beginning to develop a new way of doing theology that was wishing to address the threefold marginalization of women, black women, poor women. Okay. Context of queer. You know what? Have you heard about queer theology or ethics? Queer theology refers to LBGT. Okay, that is a kind of a theology that is born out of the experience of gays. No, uh, those happy people, gays. That's why they say gay. Anyway, dehumanizing. They're addressing the context of dehumanizing homophobia. Okay, they call for gay liberation and emancipation of gays from homophobia. Okay, because that led to their own oppression. So they want to put religion also the service of their own emancipation. There are a lot of theologians now who are involved in this. In the next issue of Hapag, we will see that there is an article that I included there coming from a Protestant pastor who is gay and who actually has listened to, stories of gay people. And he's trying to put forward the dimension of the gay. Ralph Allison, for example, is another Catholic prominent gay theologian who actually has articulated the need to be able to lead to gay liberation and emancipation. They have a new concept of God, no? That God is not sexed in the first place. Okay, so one needs to transcend the gender differences. Okay, and then of course ethics into context, environmental concerns. This gives way to the need to recapture integrity of creation that God is actually calling for our, ay sorry, naku, saan yun? Anyway, okay, yun. So, yan. Okay, so, ito po, especially yung mga ecofeminists, okay, are trying to argue that if we're going to solve the problem of environment, we have to be able to recapture the vision and the perspective of women, which is not about domination of creation, but it is about care, loving, and sensitivity to the Mother Earth. Unlike the perspective of men, which always wants to dominate, okay, and destroy, etc. So if we want to recapture a way to solve environmental crisis, they say, the ecofeminists would say, look at what women can contribute and appreciate that. So I would like to end there. Do you have any question?